The desert was still trembling from the afternoon dust storm when Thomas Hale finally reined in his horse at the edge of a narrow canyon. The sky above the Arizona Territory burned orange and violet, streaked with the last light of dusk. Sand clung to his coat, his hat brim, even the corners of his eyes. He had been riding for hours, searching for scattered cattle that had bolted when the storm howled across the plains. Thomas was not a reckless man by nature, but exhaustion made him impatient. He had built his ranch from nothing: sweat, calloused hands, and stubborn pride. Every lost animal meant lost money, every wasted hour cut into survival. So when he spotted a thin ribbon of green cutting through the desert rock, a hidden oasis, he didn't stop to wonder who else might claim it. The canyon narrowed as he rode deeper. Cottonwood trees clung to the stream's edge, their leaves whispering in the fading light. The air felt cooler here, almost sacred in its stillness. His horse snorted softly. Grateful for the scent of water, Thomas dismounted and dropped the reins loosely over a low branch. That was when he saw it, near the stream. On a flat stone darkened by years of smoke and sun, rested a carefully wrapped bundle, red cloth bound tightly with sinew, eagle feathers tucked into its folds. Small beads glinted faintly as the last rays of sunlight touched them. It was placed deliberately, not forgotten or abandoned. Thomas frowned. He had heard stories about Apache territory stretching across these lands, but he had never crossed paths with them before. He told himself the storm must have scattered every one. The place looked empty. He stepped closer. "Don't touch that." The voice was calm but sharp enough to slice through the quiet. Thomas turned quickly. A woman stood several paces away, half shadowed by the cottonwoods. Her dark hair was braided neatly over one shoulder. Her expression was not wild or angry. It was controlled, watchful. She wore simple buckskin clothing adorned with subtle beadwork that caught the dying light. Thomas straightened, instinctively defensive. "I'm just getting water." Her gaze shifted briefly to the bundle and back to him. "Then get water," she said evenly, "but do not touch that." There was urgency beneath her composure, not fear for herself, fear for what might follow. Thomas felt irritation prickle in his chest. He had been riding all day, choking on dust, losing cattle, and now a stranger was ordering him around on open land. "It's just a cloth bundle," he muttered. "It is not just anything," she replied, but exhaustion clouded his judgment. To him, it looked like a superstition, an old ritual object left beside a public stream. He stepped toward it, intending only to move it slightly so he could kneel more comfortably by the water. The woman took a half step forward. "Please." For a moment, their eyes locked. There was something there, not hostility, but warning. Thomas hesitated, done stubborn pride. "One." He reached out and brushed the bundle aside with the back of his hand. The reaction was not dramatic at first. No lightning split the sky, no immediate cry of outrage. But the air shifted. A breeze stirred the trees, though the canyon had been still. The feathers trembled where the bundle rolled. Slightly against the stone, the woman's face drained of color. From somewhere above the canyon walls came a low, rhythmic sound, a drum dot, then another dot. Thomas slowly straightened. Shadows appeared along the ridges. Dark figures stepping into view against the twilight sky. Warriors emerging silently from rock and brush, as if the canyon itself had birthed them. Thomas's pulse pounded in his ears. The woman closed her eyes briefly, as though mourning something already set in motion. "I told you," she whispered. The drums grew louder, echoing down the canyon walls. The peaceful oasis no longer felt empty. It felt watched, judged. Thomas realized too late that he hadn't moved an object. He had crossed a line he did not understand. The drums did not rush. They did not need to. Their steady rhythm carried certainty. The kind that does not question whether it will be obeyed. Thomas stood frozen beside the stream, the red-wrapped bundle lying slightly askew on the stone where he had brushed it. The Apache woman moved first. She stepped forward carefully, lifting the sacred bundle with both hands as though cradling something alive. Her fingers were steady, but her jaw was tight. Warriors descended from the canyon walls with silent precision. They did not shout or run. They simply appeared, bows slung across their backs, rifles in hand, faces unreadable in the fading light. Within seconds, Thomas and his horse were surrounded. His instincts screamed at him to reach for his revolver. He didn't. He counted at least 15 men. More shadows moved above. He was outnumbered beyond hope. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his hands away from his sides. "I didn't mean," he began. A warrior stepped forward and struck the ground at Thomas's feet with the butt of his rifle, not hitting him, but close enough to send a message. Silence. The woman spoke quickly in her language, her voice urgent but measured. She gestured toward Thomas, then toward the bundle, then to the sky. The warriors listened, but their expressions did not soften. Thomas felt sweat slide down his spine despite the cooling air. He had heard frontier stories of raids, of ambushes, of vengeance, swift and merciless. He had dismissed many as exaggerations. Now he understood something different. This was not chaos, that was order. A tall, older warrior stepped forward, his hair streaked with gray, his posture commanding without effort. He did not need to raise his voice. He spoke a single sentence. The woman translated quietly. though she did not look at Thomas. "You touched what was not yours to touch." "I was just moving it," Thomas said, frustration slipping into his tone. "I didn't know what it was." Her eyes flicked to him sharply, warning him again. Tone mattered here. The elder warrior's gaze shifted to the bundle, now secured in the woman's hands. He reached out, adjusting the feathers reverently. His expression tightened. The drums stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound. Two warriors stepped behind Thomas and seized his arms. Their grip was firm but not cruel. His revolver was removed from its holster. His knife taken, his horse led away. "Wait," Thomas said, anger flaring now that fear had settled into something steadier. "I didn't steal anything. I didn't break it." The woman spoke again to the elder, her voice calmer now, though still urgent. She pointed toward the canyon entrance, toward the desert beyond, perhaps explaining the storm, the lost cattle. His ignorance. The elder listened. Then he nodded once. Thomas was turned toward the deeper part of the canyon. They walked him into the heart of the encampment. As they emerged into a wider clearing, he saw families gathered near low fires, children pulled back behind mothers, elders rising slowly from their seats. Word had traveled quickly. Eyes followed him, not wild, not screaming, but filled with something colder than rage. Disrespect. At the center of the clearing stood a larger fire pit, unlit but ringed with stones painted in faded symbols. Thomas recognized enough to understand this place mattered. The woman stepped ahead of him and carefully placed the sacred bundle upon a higher stone, near the pit. Several elders approached it immediately, inspecting the cloth, murmuring to one another. One older woman ran her fingers across the feathers and closed her eyes. Thomas swallowed. "What is it?" he asked quietly. The Apache woman finally looked at him fully. "It carries prayers for the fallen," she said. For warriors who died protecting this land, the meaning struck him harder than any rifle. But could have, he had not moved a decoration. He had touched memory. The elder warrior raised his hand. The clearing fell silent again. The woman translated, her voice softer now. "The council will decide what your touch has cost." Torches were lit around the clearing as night settled fully over the canyon. The glow of firelight flickered across painted stones and watchful faces. Thomas realized this was no longer about water, and whatever came next would not be decided by him. Night settled fully over the canyon, wrapping the encampment in a deep indigo hush, broken only by the crackle of torches. The air had turned cool, but Thomas felt heat rising from the ring of firewood stacked in the center of the clearing. The unlit pit from earlier was now alive with flame, casting long, wavering shadows across stone and earth. He stood in the middle of it all, not bound, but not free. The sacred bundle rested on a flat stone beside the fire, newly straightened and carefully its red cloth glowed in the firelight, feathers trembling slightly whenever a draft passed through the canyon. It no longer looked small or ordinary. It looked powerful. The elders gathered in a semicircle opposite Thomas. Men and women both, faces lined with age and experience. Behind them stood warriors, arms crossed, eyes sharp. The rest of the village formed a wider ring, silent observers to what would unfold. The tall gray-haired elder who had spoken before stepped forward again. His presence alone commanded attention. He said several slow, deliberate sentences in Apache. The woman, Ayana, stood slightly to Thomas's left. "He says," she translated carefully, "that when something sacred is disturbed, balance is disturbed. When balance is disturbed, danger follows." Thomas swallowed. "I said I didn't know." Ayana's voice lowered. "Ignorance does not erase consequence." The elder continued speaking. His voice never rose, yet every word seemed to press against Thomas's chest. "He says," Ayana translated, "that the bundle carries the names and prayers of those who died defending this canyon. It is touched only by chosen hands during ceremony. When you moved it, you stepped into that ceremony without invitation." A murmur moved through the gathered crowd, not loud, but heavy. Thomas looked at the bundle again. He imagined mothers grieving sons. Warriors remembered in silence. Traditions older than his ranch, older than the fences he had hammered into the soil. "I meant no insult," he said, forcing steadiness into his voice. "Where I come from, land and water aren't owned by spirits." A flicker of tension passed through the warriors at his words. Ayana stiffened slightly before translating. She softened the phrasing, choosing her words carefully in Apache. The elder listened without interruption. When she finished, he studied Thomas for a long moment. Then another elder, older still, his hair completely white, stepped forward. His voice was rougher but firm. He spoke passionately, gesturing toward the canyon walls. Ayana's translation came slower now. He says, "Intention does not matter to the spirits. The act matters. If a man walks into a fire by accident, he still burns." A younger warrior suddenly stepped forward from the ring, anger flashing openly in his eyes. He spoke sharply, his voice cutting through the night. Several others murmured in agreement. Ayana hesitated before translating. "He says the punishment must be strong. Blood, answers and balance." The meaning landed heavily. Thomas felt his pulse thud in his ears again, but he kept his shoulders squared. Running was impossible. Begging would make it worse. Ayana stepped forward without being asked. She addressed the elders directly, her voice clear and unwavering. Though Thomas could not understand the language, he recognized courage when he saw it. She pointed briefly toward him, then toward the canyon entrance, likely explaining the storm, the scattered cattle, his ignorance of their ceremony. The younger warrior interrupted her, speaking sharply. A few heads nodded. Suspicion. The gray-haired elder raised a hand. Silence returned instantly. He looked at Ayanna, then at Thomas. He spoke slowly. Ayanna's voice, when she translated, carried tension beneath control. He says death would restore balance quickly, but sometimes the spirits choose another path. The fire crackled louder, as if leaning in. The council will not decide tonight with anger, she continued. At sunrise, the spirits will be consulted. A trial may be given. Thomas exhaled slowly, barely aware he had been holding his breath. But understand, Ayanna added quietly, turning her eyes fully to him now. A trial is not mercy, it is opportunity. An opportunity can still end in death. The elder struck the ground once with his staff. The judgment for the night was sealed. Warriors stepped forward to escort Thomas away from the fire, not to a cell, but to a guarded space at the edge of the encampment. He was given water, no ropes. Trust or confidence that he could not escape. As the council dispersed and the flames burned lower, Thomas glanced once more toward the sacred bundle glowing in red against the dark. He had thought the desert was empty land. Tonight, under firelight, he understood he had walked into a world older and far less forgiving than his own. Dawn came quietly, but no one in the canyon had truly slept. A pale blue light spilled over the canyon walls, softening the harsh lines of rock and shadow. Thomas had remained seated through most of the night, guarded but untouched, his thoughts circling the same bitter truth. One careless moment had placed his life in the hands of strangers. When the first ray of sunlight struck the highest ridge, a low chant began near the center of the encampment. The council had gathered again. Thomas was escorted forward, not roughly, but firmly. The entire village seemed present. Children clung to their mothers. Warriors stood alert but controlled. The sacred bundle rested once more upon its stone, now positioned so the rising sun illuminated it directly. A medicine man stepped into the light. His hair was bound with leather strips, his face marked with pale ash. He carried a staff adorned with small bones and beads that clinked softly as he moved. He began to chant in a low rhythmic tone. Circling the fire pit, smoke from burning herbs curled upward, drifting toward the cliffs. The atmosphere felt heavier than the night before, not angry, but solemn. Ayanna stood beside Thomas again. They are asking the spirits whether blood must answer what you did, she said quietly. Thomas nodded stiffly. He had never believed much in rituals, but standing here, surrounded by silence and expectation, he felt the weight of something deeper than superstition. The medicine man stopped suddenly. He cast a handful of powder into the flames. Sparks shot upward, swirling in the air before settling. The elder chief stepped forward. He spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the clearing. Ayanna translated, "The spirits do not demand your death." A murmur rippled outward. Relief flickered through Thomas's chest, brief and fragile. Balance must be restored, she continued. The chief gestured toward the northern horizon beyond the canyon. 3 nights ago, Ayanna translated, raiders stole 12 of our horses. They were taken under darkness. Those horses were blessed during the same ceremony you interrupted. Thomas understood immediately. This was not coincidence. The loss remains unbalanced, she said. The spirits see 2 disturbances, the sacred bundle and the stolen herd. The chief spoke again, slower this time. Ayanna's eyes shifted toward Thomas as she translated. You will bring back the horses. Thomas blinked. That's it. Her expression hardened. If you fail, your blood restores balance instead. The simplicity of it chilled him. The younger warrior from the night before stepped forward again, protesting sharply. He did not trust an outsider with such a task. Others murmured in agreement. The chief silenced them with a raised hand. He will not go alone, Ayanna said. Thomas turned to her. Who's going with me? She met his gaze steadily. I am. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Even Thomas felt it. The younger warrior objected immediately, speaking with visible anger. Ayanna responded just as firmly, her voice unwavering. The chief listened, then nodded once. It is decided, she said. Thomas frowned. Why you? Because I warned you, she replied, and because I speak your language. If you try to run, I will be the one who answers for it. That landed harder than any threat. The chief stepped closer to Thomas now, studying him carefully. Though Thomas did not understand the words, he understood the message. This was not a favor, it was a chance balanced on a blade's edge. A warrior returned Thomas's revolver, unloaded, his knife sheathed but inspected. His horse was brought forward. You leave now, Ayanna said. The raiders travel toward the dry mesas. If we delay, we lose their trail. Thomas mounted slowly, still absorbing the reality of it all. Yesterday, he had been chasing cattle beneath a storm. Today, he was riding to recover stolen horses for a tribe that might kill him if he failed. Ayana mounted her own horse with fluid ease as they rode out of the canyon together. The drums began again, not angry this time, but steady, measured, a reminder. This was not redemption yet. It was a test. The desert stretched endlessly in front of them, pale gold under the rising sun. Thomas and Ayana rode side by side along a narrow trail that wound through rocky hills and scattered mesquite bushes. Behind them, the canyon village slowly disappeared into the distance, hidden by stone walls and heat haze. At first, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not comfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who did not yet know how to trust each other. Thomas shifted in his saddle, wincing slightly as the wound on his arm from the previous night's struggle pulsed beneath his shirt sleeve. He had tied it with a strip torn from his own bandana. Finally, he broke the quiet. "I didn't know that bundle was important," he said. Ayana kept her eyes on the horizon. "You are not the first outsider to say that." Thomas frowned. "So what happens to them? The ones who touch things they don't understand." She considered that for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes they are punished. Sometimes they are taught. It depends on whether they show respect after they learn." Thomas glanced at her. "Do I still have a chance at that? You rode back with us instead of running," she said simply. "That is a start." The trail narrowed as they entered a stretch of dry canyon land where red rocks rose like broken teeth from the earth. The air was hotter here, heavier. Thomas could feel sweat gathering under his collar. He thought about the sacred bundle. What was inside it? He asked quietly. Ayana did not answer immediately. She slowed her horse slightly so they were riding closer together. "Prayer tokens," she said. "Small pieces of bone and carved wood. Names of warriors who died protecting these lands. Their families place prayers inside. During ceremony, the bundle is opened. Then it is sealed again." Thomas swallowed. "I really thought it was just decoration." She looked at him then, not with anger, but with something like sadness. "That is what worries us about settlers. They see land, they see water, but they do not see memory." Thomas didn't have a good reply to that. Instead, he changed the subject. "Those raiders, you think we can actually catch them?" "Yes," she said. "If they are the same band who attacked the northern trading trail, they move with stolen herds, which slows them." They rode for another hour before Ayana suddenly raised her hand, signaling him to stop. She dismounted quietly and crouched near the ground. Thomas followed, trying to move as silently as possible. She pointed to hoofprints in the dust. "Fresh," she said, "no more than a few hours old." Thomas felt adrenaline tighten in his chest. "So we're close." She nodded. "Too close to ride loudly." They continued on foot, leading their horses slowly through rocky terrain. The sun climbed higher, beating down relentlessly. Thomas's mouth felt dry, despite the waterskin he carried. Eventually, Ayana stopped again and pulled him behind a low ridge of rock. Below them lay a small encampment, rough tents made from canvas and animal hides. Horses were tied loosely near a dry stream. Men with rough beards and worn clothing moved lazily around small cooking fires. Raiders, Thomas counted quickly. 8 visible, possibly more inside the tents. Ayana spoke softly. "You will create a distraction." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "That's your plan. You are a rancher," she said. "You know how to move animals without panicking them." He almost smiled despite the danger. "And you?" he asked. "I will cut the ropes and lead the horses away." Thomas exhaled slowly. "If this goes wrong, we both die." "Yes," she said calmly. "That is always true when balance is at stake." They watched the camp for several minutes, memorizing patrol patterns, counting guards, noting where the horses were tied. Then Ayana looked at him once. "Do not try to be a hero," she said. Thomas nodded. They split into the dry brush, moving toward the raider camp under the harsh desert sun. Two unlikely allies walking into danger together. Night returned to the desert like a dark blanket, swallowing the harsh heat of the day. The raider camp lay quiet beneath a sky crowded with stars that seemed brighter out here, far from towns and ranch lights. A cold wind moved across the open land, rustling dry brush and carrying faint scents of smoke and cooking meat. Thomas and Ayana waited in the shadows of a rocky outcrop a short distance from the camp. They had spent the afternoon observing the raiders' habits. 2 guards remained awake at any given time. The horses were tied near a narrow wash where the ground was soft and easier to move quietly. The raiders were confident. Overconfident, Thomas thought. Ayana spoke in a whisper. "When I cut the ropes, you move toward the horses. Make noise in the opposite direction. Throw rocks if you must." "What about you?" Thomas asked. "I will move like the wind," she said simply. Thomas shook his head slightly. "That's not reassuring." She gave the smallest hint of a smile. "It is meant to be reassuring." They waited until the campfires burned low. One of the guards eventually walked away from his post to sit near the fire with the others, laughing quietly. The second guard remained near the horse line but seemed half asleep. Ayana placed a hand lightly on Thomas's arm. Now she moved first, slipping through the brush with incredible silence. Thomas followed a few seconds later, moving toward the opposite side of the camp perimeter. Para's heart pounded loudly in his ears, but he forced himself to breathe slowly. He grabbed a loose rock and tossed it toward a cluster of bushes far from the horses. The rock struck with a loud crack. One of the raiders stood up immediately. "Who's there?" Thomas threw another rock in the opposite direction and made a low animal-like noise, trying to mimic something large moving through brush. "Probably a coyote," one of the raiders said lazily, but the noise worked. Two men walked away from the horse line, scanning the darkness with their rifles held loosely. That was Ayana's signal. She was already at the horse ropes. Her knife flashed once in moonlight as she cut the first tether. The horse snorted softly but did not panic. She spoke gently in Apache, calming it with soft sounds and hand movements. Thomas continued making noise, moving further into the brush, drawing attention away. Suddenly, one of the raiders shouted, "Hey, someone's out there." Gunshots cracked through the night. Bullets tore into dirt and rocks near Thomas's feet. He threw himself behind a boulder, heart hammering violently. "Ayana," he whispered. Then he heard hooves, moving, not panicked. Controlled. Ayana had already freed several horses and was slowly leading them toward a narrow trail away from the camp. She moved like part of the herd, keeping low and calm, guiding the animals without spooking them. Thomas fired his revolver once into the air. He hated doing it, but it made the raiders rush toward his position instead of toward the horses. "Thieves!" he shouted in English. "Come get me." That was enough. More raiders ran toward the gunfire. Meanwhile, Ayana slipped through the darkness with the horses following her like shadows following moonlight. Thomas retreated slowly, keeping himself between the raiders and the escaping herd. A bullet grazed the rock beside his shoulder, sending sparks of stone dust into his face. Finally, he turned and ran. The raiders were too focused on the noise and confusion to realize. The horses were gone until it was too late. By the time Thomas reached the ridge where Ayana waited, she was already mounted on her horse. 12 stolen horses trailing behind her in a loose but controlled formation. "You took longer than expected," she said calmly. Thomas was breathing hard. "I was trying not to die." She nodded. Acceptable effort. Together, they turned and rode into the darkness, leaving the angry shouts of the raiders behind them as the desert swallowed the sound. They rode back toward the canyon village with the stolen horses moving like a dark, shifting cloud behind them. The night was nearly gone, replaced by the first pale hints of dawn creeping across the eastern horizon. The desert was colder now, the air sharp against Thomas's sweat-soaked shirt. Neither he nor Ayana spoke much during the return journey. Exhaustion weighed on both of them, but there was something else as well: anticipation. Winning the horses did not guarantee survival. It only guaranteed another trial. The herd moved steadily, guided by Ayana's quiet commands and occasional low whistles. Thomas was impressed by how calmly she controlled the animals. Ranching knowledge had taught him that panic spreads quickly through herds, but these horses followed her as if they trusted her completely. Finally, the canyon village came into view, hidden between towering rock walls glowing faintly in dawn light. Even from a distance, Thomas could see people waiting. Word had traveled fast. As they approached, warriors stood at the canyon entrance in a silent line, not threatening, but watching. The tension in the air was heavier than before. Ayana raised her hand, signaling the herd to slow. Thomas dismounted slowly as they entered the village clearing. Children watched from behind their mothers. Elders stood near the fire pits that had been relit for the morning ceremony. The sacred bundle had been placed back upon its stone altar, now surrounded by fresh herbs and offerings. The chief stepped forward. Ayana spoke first, explaining what had happened. She described the raider camp, the patrol patterns, the escape. Several warriors stepped forward to examine the horses, checking brands, injuries, and markings to confirm they were truly the stolen herd. One by one, they nodded. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Relief, respect, but not full acceptance. Thomas could feel it. He had returned, not as a prisoner, but not yet as a friend either. The chief approached him slowly. Thomas noticed the man's eyes were sharp, measuring, weighing character rather than appearance. The chief spoke. Briefly, Ayana translated. "He says you did not run when given a chance. That matters." Thomas nodded. "I wouldn't have gotten far, anyway." A faint hint of approval crossed the chief's expression. But then he turned toward the horizon, where dark storm clouds were gathering strangely fast. Not normal weather patterns, these clouds looked heavy and low, pressing toward the land like a physical presence. Ayana's expression tightened. "The spirits will judge again," she said quietly. Thomas frowned. "How?" "The storm ritual," she said. "The council will ask for signs. If the spirits are pleased, the storm will pass without damage. If not," he didn't need her to finish the thought. The medicine man began preparing the ritual area again, lighting sage and spreading powdered herbs into the fire. The sacred bundle was held briefly by the chief, who lifted it toward the darkening sky in silent prayer. The wind picked up suddenly, not violently, but deliberately. Like breathing, worries began gathering in the clearing once more. Not in anger this time. In expectation, the chief spoke again. Ayana translated. "He says balance is not restored by action alone. It is restored when intention and result are the same." Thomas understood. He had helped recover the horses. But the final judgment was still coming. Thunder rolled faintly across the distant mountains, low and slow, like something waking up. Thomas looked toward Ayana. She didn't smile, but she did not look afraid either. That gave him more comfort than any victory. Storm arrived like a living thing, moving across the horizon. Dark clouds pressed low against the mountains surrounding the canyon, their undersides flickering with distant lightning that did not yet make sound. The wind grew stronger, carrying dust and loose leaves across the village clearing. Children were ushered toward shelters. Fires were shielded with leather coverings to keep them from being extinguished. Thomas stood near the center of the encampment, feeling the wind tug at his clothes and hair. Ayana stood beside him, her expression serious but controlled. "The storm is not natural," she said quietly. "It is part of the ritual." Thomas frowned. "You can call storms, not call," she corrected. "Ask. The spirits decide how to answer." He didn't know how to respond to that, so he stayed silent. The entire village gathered in the clearing despite the wind. This was important. No one hid during judgment rituals. The sacred bundle had been placed back upon its stone altar at the center of the ritual circle, now surrounded by small offerings, cornmeal, beads, dried herbs, and small pieces of turquoise. The medicine man stepped forward, wearing a cloak of woven feathers that fluttered violently in the wind. He began chanting. The chant was low and rhythmic, matching the sound of wind moving through canyon passages. The fire in the center of the clearing burned higher despite the wind, as if resisting being extinguished. Thomas felt goosebumps rise along his arms. The medicine man lifted a bowl, filled with powdered herbs, and threw it into the fire. Flames burst upward in bright orange. Spirals. Thunder answered from the distant clouds, not immediately, but with a slow rumble that rolled across the land like a warning. The elder chief stepped forward again. Ayana translated quietly. "He is asking the spirits if you acted with true balance, or if you only acted to save yourself." Thomas swallowed. "Both," he admitted. "At first, I only wanted to live." Ayana repeated his words in Apache, though she softened them slightly to maintain respect. The wind suddenly intensified, whipping dust across the clearing. Several villagers stepped back, murmuring anxiously. Lightning flashed across the mountains, not striking the village, but striking the distant ridge above the canyon entrance, splitting a dead tree in half. The crash of thunder followed almost immediately. The medicine man's chanting grew louder. Yana, single quotes as hand tightened slightly around Thomas's sleeve. "The spirits are watching," she said. Another flash of lightning illuminated the sacred bundle on the altar. For a brief moment, Thomas thought he saw something move inside the red cloth, but it was probably just shadows from the firelight. The chief raised his staff toward the sky. He spoke loudly, challenging the storm. Ayana, translated in a hurried whisper. "He is asking the spirits to show if they are satisfied." The wind suddenly dropped, not completely, but enough that dust stopped swirling violently, and fires burned more steadily. Then, slowly, the storm clouds began to drift eastward instead of toward the canyon. A low murmur spread through the crowd. Not celebration, understanding. The medicine man lowered his hands. The chanting stopped. The chief turned toward Thomas. Ayana translated. "He says the spirits did not take revenge. That means balance was restored through your actions." Thomas felt relief wash through him so strongly he almost felt dizzy. But the chief was not finished speaking. Ayana's voice became softer as she translated the final words. "He says balance is not forgiveness. It is responsibility." Thomas nodded slowly. He understood the village would not forget what happened, but they would allow him to leave as a man who had earned another chance. The storm moved away completely, leaving clear skies behind it as dawn faded into full daylight. Yet Thomas had a strange feeling that this was not the end of his judgment, only the beginning of a different kind of life. The morning after the storm was unnaturally quiet. No drums, no chants, only the soft sound of wind moving through the canyon grasses and the distant calls of desert birds circling high above. The sky was clear, washed clean by the storm's passing. It felt like the land itself was holding its breath. Thomas woke before sunrise. He had barely slept. His thoughts kept replaying everything: the sacred bundle, the storm ritual, the chief's words about responsibility. Even though he had survived the judgment of the spirits, he could still feel tension lingering in the village, like a drawn bow. Ayana was already awake when he stepped outside the shelter where he had been resting. She handed him water without speaking. "You knew this wasn't finished," Thomas said quietly. She nodded once. "There is always someone who disagrees with peace." He knew immediately who she meant. By the time the sun began to rise over the canyon walls, the entire village had gathered again in the central clearing. This time, the atmosphere was different, less ceremonial, more tense. Thomas spotted the younger warrior who had argued for punishment during the earlier council meetings. The man stood at the front of the crowd, arms folded, jaw tight. Ayana spoke quietly. "He believes you bring weakness to the tribe by living." Thomas exhaled slowly. "And I assume he wants to prove otherwise." "Yes." The chief stepped forward and spoke briefly to the crowd. Ayana translated, "He says the spirits have allowed you to live, but warriors must still measure strength among themselves." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. "That sounds like a duel." "It is a duel," she said, "but not to the death unless someone refuses mercy." The younger warrior stepped forward into the center of the clearing. He removed his outer vest and laid it on a rock. Then he drew a long knife from his belt. Ayana turned to Thomas. "You do not have to fight him," she said quietly. Thomas looked at the warrior, saw anger, pride, fear hidden beneath both. "I know," Thomas said, "but if I refuse, he will never accept that I didn't come here to conquer anything." She studied him for a moment, then nodded once. Thomas stepped forward. He was given back his revolver, still unloaded. This was not about killing. This was about proving character. The warrior attacked first, fast, aggressive. He swung the knife in sharp arcs designed to drive Thomas backward. Thomas was not a trained fighter, but ranch work had taught him balance, timing, and how to move with animals rather than against them. He dodged the first strike. The second cut grazed his sleeve. Thomas didn't strike back immediately. He kept moving, keeping distance, forcing the warrior to tire himself through aggression. The crowd watched in silence. Finally, the warrior lunged too far forward. Thomas stepped aside, grabbed his wrist, twisted carefully, and forced the knife from his hand without injuring him. The weapon fell into the dust. Thomas could have struck him. Instead, he released him. The warrior stumbled but did not fall. They stood facing each other, breathing heavily. Thomas did not raise his fists again. The warrior hesitated, then slowly lowered his head, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. He stepped back. The duel was over. The crowd exhaled collectively, tension breaking like a snapped rope. The chief spoke briefly. Ayana translated, "He says strength is not measured by who wins. It is measured by who chooses to stop fighting." The warrior did not speak to Thomas, but he picked up his knife and sheathed it. A sign of acceptance. As Thomas turned to leave the center of the clearing, he realized something important. He had not been accepted because he was strong. He had been accepted because he had refused to become what they feared. The sun was high above the canyon when Thomas was told he was free to leave. The decision was not announced with ceremony or celebration. Instead, it was quiet, the way important truths are often delivered in the desert. The village had returned to its normal rhythm. Women were grinding corn near low fires. Children were chasing each other between the cottonwood trees. Warriors were repairing saddles and checking horses. The sacred bundle had been returned to its permanent resting place near the ceremonial stone altar, carefully wrapped and protected. Thomas stood near the canyon entrance, his horse already saddled and waiting. Ayana approached slowly. "You can stay longer," she said. "No one will stop you." Thomas shook his head slightly. "I think I've taken enough from this land already." She studied him for a moment, not judging, just understanding. "You did not take," she said. "You were careless once." "That is different." Thomas gave a tired smile. "Feels the same from where I'm standing." They stood in silence for a while, watching the wind move through the canyon grasses. Thomas realized how much he had changed in just a few days. When he first arrived, he had seen land, water, and survival. Now he saw memory, tradition, and something deeper, a relationship between people and land that could not be bought or fenced. The chief approached them then. He spoke briefly. Ayana translated, "He says you are not a guest anymore, but you are not a member of the tribe either. You are something in between." Thomas nodded. That felt right. The chief then did something unexpected. He removed a small object from a pouch at his belt, a carved wooden token with simple Apache symbols burned into its surface. He handed it to Thomas. "He says this is not ownership," Ayana explained. "It is remembrance, so you will not forget what happened here." Thomas accepted it carefully. The wood was warm from being carried close to the chief's body. "Thank you," he said quietly. The chief nodded once. Then Ayana walked with Thomas to his horse. "You could build a second ranch here," she said casually, though her voice carried something softer beneath the words. Thomas looked at her. "Would they want that?" "They might," she said, "if you built it with respect, not fences that cut through sacred ground." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he mounted his horse slowly. "You're going back to the village?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "They still need someone who can speak both languages." Thomas hesitated. "You saved my life more than once." "You helped save my people's horses," she replied. "That is not small." They looked at each other for a long moment. Not romantic, not formal, just two people who had survived something together. Finally, Thomas urged his horse forward a few steps. Then he stopped and turned back. "Come visit the ranch someday," he said. "If you ever want to see what I build next." She smiled slightly. "Maybe I will." He rode out of the canyon slowly, not looking back too often. The desert stretched wide and open in front of him, the same land he had crossed before, but now it felt different, not empty, just waiting. Behind him, Ayana watched until he became a small moving silhouette against the horizon. The wind carried faint echoes of distant drums, not war drums, not celebration drums, just rhythm. Memory. Thomas touched the wooden token in his pocket as he rode. He did not feel forgiven, but he did feel changed. and in the desert frontier, sometimes that was the closest thing to peace anyone could earn.